So, something positive with respect to Avengers Doomsday. Kevin Feige has said that the film takes place after Endgame. It picks up immediately after the events of that film, and presumably at some point in the film it will move forward in time because it has to catch up with the present time of the MCU, because they're going to include characters like Thunderbolts, for example, and Fantastic Four, and the new Black Panther and Shang-Chi. But it seems as if the film will be written in such a way that phases 4 and 5 can be largely ignored. The new characters introduced during those phases that I've mentioned will be presumably reintroduced in such a way that you won't need to have watched phases 4 and 5, which is good news because very little good came out of those phases anyway. There won't be a need for people to remember Black Widow, Eternals, The Marvels, She-Hulk, Miss Marvel, Ironheart, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, Captain America, Brave New World, Thor, Love and Thunder. After all, they are now moving away from the emasculated comedic joke that they turned Thor into in Love and Thunder. So we're getting the serious Thor once again, which is great. But watching phases 4 and 5 will help with context, but it won't be necessary in order to understand what's happening in Doomsday. Now, like many of you, I'm still not optimistic for the film. I don't like the convoluted multiverse plot they're going with, and I think that audience apathy has well and truly set in at this point. The story can technically ignore the details of phases 4 and 5, but it cannot ignore the damage that those phases have done to the franchise. They just were so mediocre. But I want to look at this article from CBR.com. It says Kevin Feige's CinemaCon comments may have confirmed the biggest problem with the MCU phases 4 and 5. At CinemaCon, Kevin Feige unveiled a surprising revelation that will change the way Avengers Doomsday fits with the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. During his comments, the Marvel Studios president confirmed that Doomsday will pick up immediately after the events of Avengers Endgame. This is surprisingly in line with previous comments about Doomsday acting as the direct sequel to Endgame. Even so, these puzzling comments are enough to worry audiences. Well, I have to say they don't worry me, but let's read on. This should naturally come as a shock to MCU fans, particularly because there have been 7 years of movies and television shows since Avengers Endgame first came out in 2019. In fact, there has been more content released post-Endgame than leading up to the Infinity Saga finale, with 15 films, 14 live-action Disney Plus series, and 3 special presentations leading up to Avengers Doomsday. After Marvel's recent panel, fans are left to wonder if any of these projects, which total more than 100 hours of content, really matter at all to the larger storyline of the Multiverse saga. Well, the Multiverse story never really gained traction. It's featured in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Spider-Man No Way Home, Deadpool and Wolverine, The Marvels, Loki, and it's hinted at in a post-credit scene in Captain America Brave New World. But there's no real unifying plot thread throughout those films. There's no one central multiverse story that ties them all together. The multiverse either features in or is mentioned in those movies, but there's no common multiverse story. So in that respect, Avengers Doomsday's multiverse plotline is also likely going to be entirely its own unique thing. It says this comment highlights one of the biggest issues that audiences have had with Marvel's Phase 4 and Phase 5. Many of the stories told in this era of the MCU have felt disjointed, mostly unconnected to one another save for a few rare exceptions. Unlike the Infinity Saga, the Multiverse Saga doesn't feel like it's building up to anything in particular, other than a vague multiversal threat looming on the horizon. Characters' individual storylines rarely intersect, and when they do, they don't often feel meaningful in the same way that the original Avengers team's interactions did. Yes, exactly. The stories were mostly standalone, and in phases 4 and 5, it's felt as though the writers didn't really know how to how to incorporate a larger story arc across those phases. It didn't feel like the multiverse story was gathering any momentum and building to one big crescendo like the Infinity Saga did from phases 1 to 3. It says Avengers Doomsday feels like it is exacerbating the multiverse saga's biggest issue, ignoring years of storytelling to make the last few phases feel even more disconnected. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing, really. The film brings back former leading men Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans in what some have called a desperate move to win back fans, which I think it is, but they don't really have much choice. If they're going to continue the MCU, they kind of have to do this sort of stuff. This, of course, leaves less room for characters who have taken a more prominent role in the multiverse saga, like Anthony Mackie's Sam Wilson, Captain America. Doomsday, taking place immediately after Endgame, makes the rest of the multiverse saga feel unnecessary, cheating the loyal fans who stuck around through the many projects that have taken place since the 2019 Avengers event. Well, I think they know that phases 4 and 5 didn't work out so well, and they're trying to revert to the formula that worked. They're well aware of the issues in the franchise. I mean, they even made a self-aware joke about it in Deadpool and Wolverine, when Deadpool says to Logan, "Welcome to the MCU, by the way, you're joining at a bit of a low point." And I don't think too many people will mind if Sam Wilson takes a less prominent role in this movie, because after all, Captain America Brave New World was a box office bomb. They need to go with their proven winners, and that's why Tony Stark and Steve Rogers are coming back. It says perhaps the biggest factor disproving this concern is that multiple multiverse saga characters will appear in Avengers Doomsday. Included on this list are teams like the New Avengers, which didn't form in the MCU until several years after the events of Endgame. Thus, it would be impossible for Doomsday to literally take place immediately after Endgame. Well, it can begin there. It can begin immediately after Endgame and then move forward a few years. That's what I think is going to happen. So it says all the events of the past few years aren't being erased in favour of a streamlined story. Not all of them, no. Not all of them. But the story doesn't need to over-focus too much on the 7 years between Endgame and Doomsday. They don't need to mention every character or everything that's happened. A clever way to handle this would be to focus the story from the perspective of someone like Steve Rogers, because we last saw him in Endgame when he went back in time. And then he'll be brought into the future to discover the new Avengers and all the new characters, for example. And they just have to bring him up to speed. A few lines of dialogue could explain their presence quite easily. They don't have to get into too much detail. Feige's comments are most likely an allusion to a timeline cheat that Doomsday will use to streamline its story. This allows the film to bring back characters like Chris Evans, Captain America, without worrying too much about the 7 years of his life since the events of Avengers Endgame. Everything that has come since Endgame still matters, but the multiverse is just now reacting to the Avengers' time heist. Yeah, it's all about how those 7 years are addressed in the film. And they only need to focus on the characters who appear in the film, giving them a brief introduction and explanation. Much of it will be simple enough. Streamlining is a good thing to do, especially given where the MCU is right now. Especially because there's just been so much content. So you can't include references to everything. You have to ignore lots of details. Cutting out unnecessary story elements is ideal. They've got to simplify things, and that's what this is about. So look, I think this is good news for the film. But the more immediate hurdle for Avengers Doomsday to try to overcome is the box office declines over the past 7 years prove that audience interest is in decline, and a big nostalgia crossover movie may not be enough to bring this extremely expensive movie to profitability. Those are my thoughts on this one. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Competing Forever. Remember to hit the notification bell to be notified of future updates on the channel. Take care, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.